Well, today it is my absolute privilege and honor to bring to our family at home Melissa Ohden. She's an author, a pro-life speaker. You can go to her website, melissaohden.com. Get your coffee, sit down. You don't want to miss this interview. Well, sweet Melissa, welcome to At Home with Jim and Joy.
Good to see the two of you again.
It is good to see you again. Now, I want you to tell our family at home a little bit about who you are, what happened to you, your birth story, and all the things that God has done in your life.
Yeah, I often tell people the story of my life could have been very short, right? Just another life ended by abortion. But God took that story and He expanded it now into this amazing story. I'm a convert to the Catholic Church.
Welcome
Praise
home.
Thank you. It has been such a blessing to me. And you know, a lot of people know me as a pro-life speaker or an activist and an author. And of course, what led to that is the very grace of God. But I survived a failed abortion 39 years ago. And what I know about those circumstances is that, you know, my birth mother fits most statistics when it comes to abortion. She was a college student. She was 19. She wasn't married to my biological father, even though they were engaged. And, you know, one of the greatest statistics she fits is one that isn't often talked about in our world, and that's coercion and even force. You know, we live in a society that talks about abortion being a choice and a right. But statistics tell us that most women don't report having a choice. And I now know that my birth mother had no choice. It was actually forced upon her by my own grandmother. My maternal grandmother was a prominent nurse in their community. And so this saline infusion abortion was forced upon her. And that type of procedure isn't done routinely anymore, but it was the most common procedure in the 70s. You know, the audience members might remember it. And that procedure was meant to poison me to death in the womb. It would peel away the top layer of skin, scalding the baby, and usually was completed within about 72 hours. And then premature labor was induced with the intent of that child being delivered. In my own circumstances, my medical records actually indicate that I soaked in it not for 3 days, but for 5.
Mercy.
They just kept trying time and time again over those 5 days to induce my birth mother's labor with me. You know, I joked earlier, right, I'm stubborn.
Yes.
God has used that for good.
That's a good stubborn, yes.
Yeah.
But, you know, of course, all kidding aside, the longer I soaked in that toxic salt solution, the greater the likelihood would be that my life was ended. And on that 5th day, I was delivered at a hospital. You know, all of these things were routine, except for what happened next. I was born alive. And as I told some high school students earlier this week, a lot of people call me a dreaded complication of abortion, the child who lives.
Right.
And, you know, I wish I could say that even when I was born alive, people saw the dignity and value in my life, but that didn't happen either. I now know that my grandmother, that nurse, not only forced the abortion upon my birth mother, but she was present when I was delivered. And she actually gave the demand that I be left in the hospital room to die.
Yes.
But I don't fault her for that. You know, I say, first of all, that's what this culture has done, right? Where people could make these kind of decisions about lives like mine every single day. And secondly, no matter what decision she could ever make about my life, you know, you've already touched on the point, Jim, I love her. I think people expect me to be angry or bitter or somehow jaded about this cross, right?
Right.
This cross that I didn't pick out for myself.
Right.
But I'm not. I'm so thankful to be alive, and I choose to love the people who intended to harm me, because that's how much Christ loves each and every one of us and calls to love other people in return.
That's an amazing story, and what the capacity to love. So you were born alive. Your grandmother gives the order that you should die. But then what happened to you next?
God wasn't done, right?
Right.
What was your physical condition from this attempted abortion of your life for a 5-day period and soaking in this chemical? What was your physical health like?
Because I don't look like
Yeah.
somebody who was supposed to be poisoned to death in the
Right.
womb, right?
Right.
And so the reality is the prognosis for my life was actually very guarded initially. I weighed a little less than 3 pounds when I was delivered. I was a whopping 2 pounds, 14 ounces.
At what gestational age were you delivered?
Yeah, the abortionist actually indicated on my medical records that he thought my birth mother was about 18 to 22 weeks pregnant. But the fact that I was able to live and I weighed almost that 3 pounds, they estimate she was probably more like 31 weeks.
Yeah.
Do you think they did that because maybe an abortion at that gestational, in your state at that time, was that illegal? Did they do that for legal purposes to, you know, change the records?
I'll never
I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I'll never know the answer to that. But, you know, I often think about this, especially when it comes to pregnancy centers, right? You use ultrasound to provide a window to the womb, and it changes women's lives, children's lives, to know the truth about life. On the flip side, for me, I think God hid the truth, because the longer I progressed gestationally, the
Right.
greater my likelihood
Right.
could be.
Yeah.
So it was guarded condition for you.
It was. It was.
And you don't have people around you that want to save your life, even relatives, a relative there. So what was your circumstance in terms of what happens to you?
Yeah, I now know that even though my grandmother made that demand about my life, a nurse actually rushed me from that hospital room off to the NICU. A nurse who was in the NICU that day actually contacted me just recently and was able to share details. And she said that day the door flew open, which was pretty normal for NICU. But she said what came out of the nurse's mouth, you know, it was not normal. She actually shouted, you know, that darn Dr. Kellberg messed up. He was the abortionist. And she went on and she said, she just kept gasping for breath. She just kept gasping for breath, and so I couldn't leave her there to die. And she didn't.
Praise the Lord.
You know, those nurses were some of the first people in my life to love me.
Sure.
And you would never know by looking at me today that I suffered from severe respiratory, liver problems, seizures. The doctors actually thought I had a fatal heart defect because of the way my body was presenting itself. And they didn't think I would live for very long initially. And if I did, I would suffer from multiple disabilities throughout my life. And we live in a society that hears those things.
Sure.
And somehow thinks maybe that's a life that nobody could love. Or maybe that's a life that somebody shouldn't live.
Right.
So how long did you spend in the hospital after this birth?
At that hospital about 21 days before I was sent to the next hospital.
Okay.
And it was at the next hospital that my parents came into my life.
How did that take place? How did they hear about you?
You know what I love is I was looking through some paperwork recently, and they were on a waiting list for another child. My older sister's adopted from another family, and they were told at the beginning of August of 1977, your home study's updated, but it's going to be a long time before you are up on the list to receive another child. I was born at the end of August, and they got the phone call saying, we have this little girl, would you be willing to travel this distance to meet her? And my parents often tell that story of how the first time they laid eyes on me lying in an incubator full of tubes and wires, fighting for my life, they instantly fell in love with me.
Thank God. And that was the more love that then came around to support you and to love you. I mean, because God had a plan for Melissa's life, right? Who named you?
They did.
They did.
They
Okay.
did, although the nurses named me initially.
Okay.
But my parents named me Melissa after a friend of the family who had gone through some difficulties in her life and had great strength. And so they gave me that name in return. And I like to think I've bore that name well
Yes,
over the years.
Yes, a great fighter.
So they knew the circumstances of your situation, of your birth, and they said, we desire this child. We want this child. Because I know for a lot of people, you know, it would be like, this is just too complicated. I mean, physically, I mean, it's so much, and then who knows emotionally and what's going on here. But all those reasons not to adopt you were kind of reasons for them to have pate cum, compassion, to really, you were like a live wire that you're not supposed to touch, but they grabbed the wire. They got that too, you know, that, what special people.
They are. You know, I always tell people they love me that much still today, despite everything I've put them through in the last 39 years. You know, my parents have been the most incredible support in my life. And I can't imagine anybody but them being my parents.
So you get to go home when? When do you get to go home where they say, she's okay, we can bring her home, she's out of the NICU, she's out of danger?
I was only a few months old when I was sent home to them, which is a pretty miraculous thing,
Yeah.
39 years ago,
Yeah.
right? And they still, you know, were very cautious about what my life might entail. But I can still remember, I didn't understand it at the time, but I can remember being about 5 years old and going back to that major hospital where I had been cared for. And I remember my parents sobbing. I now know that they were crying because they were told that day that the doctors really thought I had overcome most of the obstacles, and they thought that I was healthy and, you know, I would stay the course. By the grace of God,
so
right?
the hospital in which the attempt on your life, you went back there 5 years later? Is that what you're saying?
No, so I was born at St. Luke's Hospital in
Yeah.
Sioux City, Iowa, and then I was actually transferred to the University of Iowa Hospitals. And so that's a major hospital
Okay.
for many people. And so that's actually where I went for my follow-up appointment.
Okay. When did you get in touch with your own story? I mean, of what took place?
It wasn't until I was 14. I grew up knowing I was adopted, I was loved, and not just by my parents, my adoptive parents. I grew up knowing my biological parents, loved me. They gave me the gift of life and the gift of my family. That's how my parents raised my older sister and I, to know that adoption meant that we were deeply loved.
Right.
And I am so thankful for that, because I didn't question that for a second growing up, that my birth parents loved me
Yeah,
until I was 14.
right. And then what happened when you were 14?
The truth about my survival came slipping out of the seams. My older sister had faced an unplanned pregnancy herself, and in the midst of that, as a teenager, our parents decided to tell her the story of my survival, hoping that she could understand
Yeah.
just how deep of a decision she was facing in her life. And, you know, I'm so thankful that no matter how scared she was, she knew that our parents would support her and love her, and she carried her son and parented him, had other children. But in the midst of that, that's how the story came trickling down to me.
Right. And that was shock to you.
Shock and awe.
Right. And so then did you go to your parents and say, okay, is this true what she just said, and you wanted the real story?
I did. You know, my sister didn't tell me everything. I don't think I would have believed her.
Right.
But I did ask our parents, you know, to explain to me why she would say the things that she did. And, you know, I often tell people what my mom had to say that night 25 years ago is something that no parent should ever have to say. She said, "Missy, your biological mother had an abortion during her pregnancy with you, and you survived it." And there's honestly no words. You know, I've been working through this for 25 years, and at least I can now tell that story without sobbing.
Right, absolutely.
Right.
But it was every bit as devastating as my parents were afraid it was going to be.
Yeah. I mean, you must have been disoriented, you know, being told something like that, right? Because you're just thinking, this is my life as best I understand it, and being here, and now you're saying this. Did you have any inklings about anything growing up, or there's no recall of anything, or, and then this was told to you, and then you've got to orient yourself?
Yeah, being 14, I think it's hard enough to try to figure out who you are.
Right.
And then you think you know, and then suddenly you're not who you thought you were.
Right. Right. And that's really scary. Because then you're saying, what else haven't you told me? And who are you people? I mean, everything comes into question.
Oh, and who am I? I mean, that was
Right.
my greatest
Yes.
question. Like, who am I really? And as we think about entering into Holy Week, you know, I always remind people, we don't get to pick our crosses, right? Or we go, I've got one and I'm good.
Yeah, right.
You know? And I always tell people, this is not the cross I would have picked for myself.
Right.
But I am now so thankful for it
Right.
because it's changed my life, and really humbling myself has made that cross not only bearable, but it's a blessing to me.
Right.
Right.
But that's the beauty of the gospel, is that here, like you said, who wants this? You couldn't make this up. But then with the grace, but then the purpose that it gives you, it says, Melissa, yes, this was a terrible thing that happened to you, but trust me, believe in me, and I'm going to use this for good in your life and in you. I can't, thousands upon thousands of people that God has given you an opportunity to speak to, and what you have done for the pro-life movement. And what for the pro-abortion movement, how they must detest the presence of you, because you are what they tried to destroy, you know. And it's like, and there you are caught in this place. You know?
I want to, the thing of who am I, you know, when you're hearing it, it's just so huge, because it is your image, and who am I? I mean, that firmness within yourself, and then all of a sudden, you know, what you did think, this is like, there's little fissures in all of this. So what course did you take, you know, as you went down the road? Was it, you know, how did you look for yourself, or how did you find yourself, or how did you try and find affirmation, or what took place? Was it a disastrous road?
It was a bumpy road. I'll be the first person to admit that. You know, I was kind of that typical, I mean, even before that, I was a people pleaser, right? I always wanted to make my family happy. I never wanted to disappoint anybody. That's who I am. But when I found out the truth about my life, I spiraled. You know, I felt such incredible pain. And especially when we live in a culture that doesn't show a lot of respect for the unborn, and doesn't have a lot of positive things to say about people like me. You know, people say things not knowing what somebody else has gone through. And so I would hear all of these hateful, painful things, and so I was ashamed and embarrassed initially. I felt guilty for surviving because I kept thinking, why me? Right? And I was angry. I was angry initially. And I think what I did was I turned that anger inward. And I hated myself. And so I developed an eating disorder. I struggled with alcohol abuse. My family had no idea. That's so hard for my parents. You know, I think it's hard for any parent. But my parents had wanted to save me from suffering.
Right.
And of course, the truth brought about this suffering. But it was part of the process that I had to work through. And, you know, the beauty in that is that it now helps me understand the suffering that everybody goes through, and how we all make mistakes. We're all sinners. We stumble. And I just happened to be 14 and in a lot of pain. So I understand mine. But in the midst of that, the beauty is that God really saved me from myself.
Let's just pause right there for a moment. Melissa Ohden is here speaking with us about an incredible situation of surviving an abortion herself personally and going on to thrive in her life. Don't go away. Plenty more to come. We want to hear from you. We'll be right back.
Well, Melissa, you were sharing just about, here you are 14, you're starting to spin out, not knowing who you are, what is your purpose, who do you belong to, which are normal, sometimes typical challenges for a teenager, but then you just had a tsunami of facts put upon you. And so where did you go, and then how did you buoy back up?
Yeah, gratefully I didn't stay in that place for very long. And truly my parents raised me with great faith. You know, as I said, I'm a convert to the church, but my parents raised me with strong faith. And so I knew, right, the choices that I were making were not healthy and they were wrong. And I also knew God wanted more for me than what I was allowing in my life. And I think, you know, as we think about other people's spin-outs, to use your word, I think we all have our own spin-outs. And I think one of the greatest gifts for me was accepting the fact that God doesn't ever make any mistakes. No matter what everybody else in the world wants to tell you or label you as, God makes no mistakes.
So when you say he doesn't make mistakes, in terms of you as a person?
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And what you've experienced in your life, right? And that he does. He wants more for us than I think we can ever fathom. And so accepting that, even at that young age, even though I couldn't wrap my head around it the way I do now, that really helped me to heal pretty quickly.
How do you see the abortion attempt in the Lord? I mean, do you see that as he did that, or allowed that, or like, because people can get confused a little bit by what you're saying.
No, God doesn't cause suffering. God is there in the midst of it to bring about good and to heal us and to show us the way. You know, often I think about the photo of the footprints, right? The footprints in the sand.
Right.
We're living that out. Yeah, we're living that out every single day. And so I think I was really planted with that kind of faith early on. And so I knew that God was carrying me along the way. He didn't intend for me to be aborted, but what he did was want good to come from it. And so who was I to thwart his will, right? By living in sin and making mistakes and not accepting my cross. And so by the time I was about 19, I knew that God intended for me to share this story someday. And even though this is not what I thought it was going to look like, I knew it was important. And so I started looking for my biological family and trying to obtain my medical records, you know, knowing that that would be important if I came forward. And it took me 10 years to obtain my medical records and 10 years to find my biological parents. I lovingly refer to those years as my desert.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm thankful for the desert because I had to fully submit to God's will. You know, I think we often want to believe in His will when things go the way we want them to. Like, I'm going to find my birth records immediately, right? When I start searching, I'm going to find my biological family right away. And year after year after year, you know, you have to make the choice of, you know, will I just accept that maybe it's not His will for that to happen? And so really I had learned to live in peace and trust that if it was His will, it would happen in His way and in His time. And 2007 was a banner year in my life for God.
Okay. What does that mean?
Yeah, that year I actually obtained my medical records.
Oh, you did it.
Yeah, after being told time and time again, no, 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 there is no record of you. I tried one last time. And through those medical records, I actually found my biological family because they forgot to black out their names in one little tiny corner. We could call that a HIPAA violation, right? I think a lot of people would. I call it divine intervention.
Right.
Because nobody but God could have allowed those things to happen and to unfold so quickly. And so His handprints were all over that.
When you say you found them, what I'm hearing is you found out the information, but did you actually find them? How does that work its way out, or does it work its way out?
Yeah,
so you know who they are to some degree, the names, but how do you connect, or do you ever connect, or what happens?
Yeah, that's an important clarification. That's true. So I found out who they were through my medical records. And I jumped on the computer, started searching, and I actually was able to find where my biological father was. He was living in the same city that I was.
Wow.
I didn't ever expect for that to be the story. You know, I moved to the very city where my birth mother's abortion had taken place 30 years before that, thinking I was just moving there to finish my master's degree, right? Thinking it was my own free will.
Right.
Right.
Wow.
The providence of God in that journey.
Absolutely. And so I prayed about it for months before I ultimately reached out to him. I sent my birth father a letter letting him know that I was alive and well and not angry or bitter, and sent it to his office trying to protect him a little bit in his life. And it's been about 10 years ago since I sent that letter.
And still heard nothing back.
Still heard nothing.
Okay, let's pause right there. We have a phone call.
Anita's on the phone. Anita, welcome to At Home with Jim and Joy. Your question or your comment from Melissa.
Yeah, thank you. Melissa, I'm so sorry for what happened to you. And I was curious that when the nurse brought you to the intensive care unit, did not anybody object? Like typically it's the doctor that admits patients, or were other people on board that, yes, we're going to save this baby? And what did the grandmother or the mother, did they have anything to say about that? Because these days I think so many children, they're just left in buckets to die.
Thank you for your question, difficult question, but
It is
again, what
difficult.
was happening at that time with your mom as well? What did she, you know, your grandmother's there, other people there?
Do you want me to tell the whole story, do you think?
What have you discovered?
That's up to you. No, you don't.
Yeah,
you
it's
tell me.
complicated, unfortunately, because abortion complicates people's lives. I think Anita's question is so important. You know, what happened to me that day, you know, there are still children around the world, including in our own country, that are left to die. I was just reading a report the other day that detailed accounts from Florida, Michigan, and Arizona in recent years of children who had survived abortions. These are detailed reports. So we know that children are left to die, or that there are abortionists who end their lives.
Right.
I know in my circumstances, that nurse actually rushed me off to the NICU, believing that if other people found out that I was alive, that my fate would not be what it was intended to. And so I think she was very heroic that day. And you know, there's certain details that I am still trying to get to the bottom of, but what I do know is that not everybody was pleased that I was taken to the NICU for medical care.
Right.
But she did it, and I'm alive today because she was willing to do that.
Beautiful.
And you know, God has those people all over the place, believe it or not, that are intervening and stepping in to say, this is an injustice, this is wrong. And that was a Catholic hospital.
Actually, that wasn't. It was not a Catholic hospital, but it was a faith-based hospital. And you know, what I uncovered recently was that the abortionist actually did pack up and leave the day after I was delivered. And I don't know whatever happened to him after that, but I'm still trying to find out. You know, it would be my sincerest hope that maybe that was the last abortion he ever performed.
So, finding your way still, let's go back to that. I forgot where we
Yeah,
left off.
contacted my biological father. Didn't hear back from him.
10 years.
Yeah, and we can talk about the twist in that story in a second, because life is messy, right?
No.
Yeah, it is for you too? You're kidding, I know. But about that same time, I started searching for my birth mother. I couldn't find her through my searching. She had married someone after the abortion took place, so I couldn't find her. But I had found her parents, my grandmother that I now know was responsible for so much. I reached out to them, not knowing back then that she was responsible for that, and you know, asked for them to reach out to my birth mother on my behalf, never expecting to hear back. But my grandfather actually replied to my letter within days. And in it, he admitted that he knew that I knew that my live birth was not the intention. That was courageous. And he, you know, sadly told me that my birth mother had never told anybody about her abortion, which you all know is a pretty common experience for so many people. And also let me know that any messages would not be passed along to her, because in reality they were completely estranged. And I understand that now.
Yeah, and you know, what a burden when people carry that sin and that secret in their families, right? I mean, and now, truth be told, here you are, alive and beautiful and well. And now you want to come face to face with these people, and you want to say, if you're out there, I'm here, and I survived, and we can get through this. And that's scary. People are like, no, we don't want to talk about it, we don't want to know it, because you live. And not only do you live, you forgive, and you're offering love. And you're saying, like we all have to say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Absolutely.
Everybody was panicking. Everyone was, even your grandmother. You have to believe some kind of way. She thought she was doing the best thing for her daughter, right? She wasn't thinking about you. She was probably just thinking about her daughter. Because in abortion, they're never thinking about the baby. They're just thinking about the woman, right? And so you take this journey, no contact with your dad. You have contact with your maternal grandfather. And then over time, you come to know your
The rest
birth,
of the story.
the rest of the story.
Yeah, yeah. So I haven't heard from my grandparents for about 10 years now, and again had learned to trust in God's will and left it at that. And lo and behold, in 2013, one of her family members graciously contacted me. It was a cousin, and so that's how I found out that the abortion was forced versus it being her decision, that my grandmother was responsible for things. And you know, that's when I also learned, really for me, the most horrific secret of my survival. And that is that my birth mother had lived over 30 years of her life believing that I had died that day. You know, as people were asking, what did your birth mother do when you were born?
Yeah.
She wept because she did not know that I was alive. She was told that day, don't look at it.
So
It's
she
hideous.
believed that the abortion was completed.
She did. And she was, of course, in such a state after 5 days of an abortion procedure. She was not in any state physically, emotionally, spiritually to have any idea of what was going on. And so I was placed for adoption without her ever knowing that I
you
was alive.
existed. Yes.
Wow. Okay.
Talk about suffering.
Right. And then so she lives her life with that 30 years of the shame and the guilt and that secret that she has to bear.
So when you say talk about suffering, you're speaking about her
Her
suffering?
suffering.
Yeah, that's
Her
exactly what it,
suffering. Yeah.
Yeah.
where does that all go with her and you?
we're kindred spirits, her and I, you know? I mean, I don't think people would have ever suspected that, right? Like the child whose life was supposed to be ended has this kindred spirit with her mother who had the abortion forced upon her. But when you know the story, you can recognize that. But we spent a few years getting to know each other, you know, trusting one another, piecing our lives together, because she knew a little bit, I knew a little bit. And she really had to learn to trust that I love her and I have forgiven her, because that was hard for her. And so, you know, we spent those years getting to know each other, and we finally met face to face for the first time last year, right around this time. And what an incredible blessing.
Were you scared? What were you feeling? What were you
I
what were you
laughed because
processing?
I felt like I was strong, right? And I was so excited. But I turned to my husband that day and I said, I could just run away.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I know that we're minutes away from this happening and I could just run away,
Yeah.
but I won't. And I don't know why I was scared, except for just the nervousness of it all.
The magnitude.
Yeah.
You're going to see her face.
And
Okay.
I will never forget just walking up to her that day and embracing her and saying, you know, she said, I've been waiting for this. And I said, it's been a long time. And this was not the story, right? This was
Right.
not the story that humans tried to write. But it's the story that God wrote. And that's where my tears come from. You know, my tears in the past used to be tears of pain, right? And now there are these incredible tears of joy. It has been such an honor to meet her and have her in my life. And we're committed to each other. She knows that I have my parents and she will never replace them. But she has this other place in my heart and now in my life. And so this is our new normal.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Well, and the encounter, I mean, in that encounter, you are touching and experiencing extravagant mercy.
Absolutely.
I mean, you're like, wait a minute, that's gospel life. You know, for you and for her and for your husband to witness that.
She's touching extravagant mercy.
Yes.
The mother.
Yes.
Especially.
Yes,
to me.
but even, I mean, even as she thought, whatever, if she was in a forced abortion, I mean, what she went through as a tormented woman all the days of her life, right? And the power of that upon her.
And I wish everybody could experience that. I mean, we
Yeah.
all have the opportunity. You know what, I think God gives us all these opportunities to experience that mercy and that love. And I think the question is, you know, are we living out our lives in the way that makes that possible? Because I think we do all thwart God's will
Yeah.
with our own free will.
I think what you said about living God's story, like God might not do all the circumstances and situations, right? But they all contribute to your story, which is His story. But if you want to live your story or somebody else's story, then you miss the mercy.
Right.
You do.
Because
It
God's
will be
saying, I'm
minus
trying
it.
to write
Yeah.
straight on crooked lines.
Yes.
This is really crooked. Life is really crooked. But do you want how I could turn this into something merciful and beautiful? Is that what you're saying? But we could still thwart that.
Yeah,
And you could have thwarted this.
absolutely. I can think of 100 different stops along the way that would have prevented that day from happening.
Right.
And so I look for the opportunity every day to see and to feel how the Lord is leading me, because I get to experience that blessing.
Right. And the encounter. And so now your birth mother is in your life. And she has you. She has your children. She has a whole family. You have a stepsister.
I do. I have 2 stepsisters. One of them I communicate with all of the time, just because we're in that stage of life with children, and so we have all of these things in common. And it's almost, I mean, it's surreal.
Yeah.
For lack of a better word, I'm just like
Yeah,
searching
yeah.
for it. It's overwhelming.
I can't. Do you resemble her? Or are there ways and mannerisms? I mean, I know I'll do my life, and I'm thinking I'm acting just like my mom, and I'm, you know, we're never going to be our mother, and then all of a sudden you are her.
I'm this strange mix of,
Yeah.
of genetics and the nature and the nurture, right?
Yes.
I act like my adoptive parents to a T.
Yeah.
But, you know, in reality, I don't look a whole lot like my birth mother. I am the spitting image of my biological father. And a half-sister that I have through that side of the family. But you know what my birth mother and I have kind of experienced along the way is that there's little things about us, right, that are similar. And I see a huge similarity between my oldest daughter and my birth mom, just with some of their looks. But I think what I love is that she and I see that sameness of spirit. So the ability to persevere, to be strong in the face of it, she and I have those things in common.
And a wonderful stubbornness to live. We're going to take a short break. We'll be right back with this wonderful story, not of death, but of life, of redemption. Well, Melissa, it's been such a powerful time of sharing, and maybe you could just bring us up to the contemporary time of just how you're doing, your family, works that you're involved with that are of special interest for you that you want us to know.
Yeah, you know, often people say, well, where do you go from here? And I always just simply say, every single day, I hope to just fulfill God's will. So I never know what tomorrow is going to bring, but what I do know is, you know, right now we have 2 little girls. One is almost 9 and the other is 2.5.
Beautiful.
And my husband and I live in the Kansas City area with our daughters. We're so blessed. And part of the work I do, in addition to speaking and writing, is work with other survivors. You know, I spent many years in my life feeling very alone. And that was really hard for me. And so when I found out Gianna Jessen existed, that gave me some strength. And then what I found as I traveled is that I gave other people strength in return, because I would get emails and messages from people who would say, I'm a survivor too. And I always thought I was the only one.
How many have you been in touch with?
210 other survivors or their family members who communicate.
Just that you know of.
Yeah, and so we actually know that the number is much greater than that. I wish there was a fast and hard number we could get to, but what I could say is that this happens more often than what anybody can imagine or talks about.
And it has to mean so much for you to get with people that have experienced what you've experienced, and same thing with them, and some are further down the road. I guess they need a lot of encouragement and healing.
Absolutely. Yeah, most survivors, just simply knowing that they're not alone has been the biggest piece for them. But yeah, we, through the Abortion Survivors Network, connect people with local resources in their community if they need to find healing, if they want opportunities to serve, to make a difference in people's lives. And we provide them with the opportunity to share their story. Not everybody is going to be called to do what they do with their story, but I want everybody to have that opportunity to share their story if that's what they want to do.
You've also done some work in the area of post-abortion healing for those who suffer after abortion and realize, hey, you know, maybe I thought this was the right thing to do, but it's created a whole nother set of problems. And what have you done in that area? What do you want to say to women who have had abortions?
I want everybody to know that there is hope and healing and love and forgiveness to be found after an abortion. I think people maybe think an abortion survivor would be angry or condemning, judgmental, and I'm here to tell you I'm anything but that. I am probably one of the most loving, understanding people that anybody would ever find, because I understand the suffering that comes with abortion, even though I was on this other end of it. So I want people to desperately know that places like Project Rachel, Rachel's Vineyard, Silent No More, going to their local pregnancy center for post-abortion healing, whether it's in a group or one-on-one, you know, there are so many great opportunities for people to find healing in their own lives.
Yeah, and people can go to optionline.org if they're in a crisis pregnancy, or if they need post-abortion healing, and they can get them the resources that they need. Just a final word from you, straight from your heart, as we go into Holy Week and God's message to people at this time.
But it's such an important time to be grateful. You know, to live with that gratitude every single day. I do not take my life for granted. I don't take the sufferings and the trials for granted, and I see the blessing in the midst of that. And it has changed my life to have that perspective. And so I want that for everyone. And so especially as we enter into Holy Week, I would just love for people to take that opportunity to look upon their life and see the blessing that exists in both the trials and the tribulations.
And the beautiful words to say, like Jesus said on the cross, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. If you're an abortion survivor, if you're a woman that had an abortion, family members that forced that whole act, and even for abortion providers.
Yes.
And those that are in the clinics, is to say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, in this great year of mercy, to extend that.
Well,
to
Melissa
them.
Ohden, thank you so much for sharing your story, for being part of the EWTN family. We treasure what you've shared. We cherish you, and it is beautiful that you exist.
Hallelujah. Thank you.
Thank you for being a part of this EWTN family. We're all in this together, and God has a great plan for your life. Keep it on EWTN. Bye now.